Okay, cool. So I am Jeroen. That's what my name, what my parents called me. I go by Jay to make it easier for everybody else. Don't bother with my last name. I am a senior program manager, product manager on the Power BI team. I'm not the senior. There's more of us. I'm not the only one, and it basically means that I try to understand where the market goes, what kind of things we want to build, and describe those features to others who actually write software. So I am responsible for the why and the what of the new features that we're working on in Power BI. And then others are responsible for the how to actually implement it. So I don't write any code. You shouldn't allow me to write any code. That's not for me. There's others that are way better than I am at that. So I focus mostly on DAX these days. But I also did the composite model stuff. You might remember the composite model preview. What was it? Composite model for direct query on analysis services, something, long name. You might remember that feature. That's also mine. So I build a bunch of features for Power BI by now, but I mostly focus on DAX. So anything that's happening in the DAX world is my work. I'm at least involved. So yeah, so that's basically where I am and what I do. So today we're going to talk about making DAX easier, and I specifically want to talk about a feature that we recently announced called Visual Calcs. Before I jump in, here's my contact details. If you ever want to reach out or want to have a chat or complain, rant, whatever, feel free to reach out. Always happy to talk and always happy to listen. So just getting that out of the way there. Okay, so can we see a show of hands? Who has ever struggled with DAX? You can raise your hand probably. Has anybody here ever struggled with DAX? Just 5 of you? Well, 12. Okay, 13. There we go. 14. So I'm going to guess that if I give this enough time, that all of you are going to raise your hand. And that's fine. And that's real, right? And it's a reality. It's a reality that we just have to face today. I mean, I struggle with DAX. Now, I am in the lucky circumstance that I work with the inventors of DAX. So whenever I get stuck, I can just ping them on Teams and go like, hey, I need to solve this. How would you do it? And they just go and done, right? But no, not everybody has that, right? So we just need to face the hard reality that DAX is very complicated and it's very hard. And our data shows that as well. We see when we talk to customers, we see that DAX being quoted as hard, or that even being marked as a top blocker for adopting Power BI or even migrating to Power BI because DAX is so hard. So this got us thinking, like, what can we do to make it easier to work with DAX, right? Are there things that we can make it easier to work with the programming language that you really need to know once you want to be successful with Power BI, which does not necessarily involve scrapping everything, but just making it easier and making it easier to work with. So the reality that people face today is, this is how we write DAX. This is how I write DAX, right? Let's just face it. It's very simple. You go online, use your favorite search engine, go to some blog or some community website, or maybe read the book or whatever, right? I have the famous books about DAX right here. You copy paste, right? You basically look up something that somebody else already did, you paste it into your window, and then you cross your fingers and you, whatever you want to do, maybe apply to some DD if that floats your boat or whatever, but you just hope for the best, right? That is the reality. And in some ways, that's really interesting to see that we came this far as a product with Power BI to the leader in the market with our core programming language that allows you to do the most interesting things with Power BI. The DAX language is so hard. And this is the reality that people feel every single day. Isn't that amazing? It's just a testament to how good the rest of the product is, that we came this far with this complicated language. So let me give you an example. Have you ever tried to do a running total in Power BI? And if you ever did, you probably tried to do it in DAX because that's the right place. So if you try to discover how to do it, you start searching. And you go and you find this. The title is hopeful. Power BI running total. Awesome. Great. Click on the link. 21 steps just showed up on your screen. 21 steps to get a running total in Power BI. Think about that. A running total. That is not rocket science. A running total is something you can do easily. Anybody can understand what a running total is. There's no algebra involved. There's no complicated math involved. It's very simple. You can do this in Excel very quickly. You can do this on the back of an envelope very quickly if you understand basic math. 21 steps. That is 21 steps too many almost. Or maybe 20 steps too many. Let's give you 1 step to do this. Not 21. Come on. How did you ever get this far as a product with this being the case? So let's imagine we can change something about how we write DAX. And this, oh, the text is not really readable, but it says, how would you want to write DAX, right? So let's imagine what we can do. Maybe we can make DAX easier. Maybe we can even go 1 step further and say, you know what? You don't have to type anything. Maybe you can just use some tool that allows you to just click and drag and therefore, kind of like Excel, create your formulas. That's where we got started, and that's where Visual Calcs actually comes in. So in summary, let's face it, DAX is hard. And to be very exact, the thing that makes DAX hard when you start talking to people, when you get over this first hurdle where people say, well, DAX is very hard, is actually filter context. The fact that you have to consider the context in which any DAX calculation is being executed inside of the model and all the filters that have been applied based on from like table filters or whatever filters that might be coming in. You basically, when you are looking at a DAX expression, you don't necessarily know, well, you don't know in what context it's going to be executed. So in order for you to validate that expression and predict the result and test that it will actually work, you have to think about all these contexts that it will potentially be used in, because your user is just going to slap it onto a visual and then drag some other things and set a slicer and another filter, and they will expect it to work. So in many ways, you have to be very defensive in your DAX writing to make sure that you handle all of that potential filter context. And that is what makes DAX hard, because you're sitting there trying to do like a 5, 6, 7-dimensional puzzle with no help, just looking at a bit of 2D image on a screen, and you have no idea. The core problem here is the filter context, and that's because the DAX calculations measures the most often used DAX calculations. I won't go into a debate about cal columns here. I know that's raging on social media. That's not where I'm after right here. Gonna talk about focus on measures for now for a sec. They're scoped to the model, and so because they're on the model, they basically have to deal with all this filter context, and you have to be very, very specific about what you want to do. And then typical business type calculations, like the running sum I already told you, when you're brand new to Power BI, you kind of would expect that something like that, as a business intelligence application, it would have business calculations built in. Not so. A versus previous, a versus first, or a running sum or a moving average, there's no help. You have to write this on your own. And of course, there's help in the community, there's help on blogs, as already said, but then we get back to the meme of copy, paste, and cross your fingers. So what if we could turn all of this upside down? What if we could say, let's not write the calculation inside of this model where you have to deal with all this complex filter context that is just breaking your brain. What if we could actually think about what you want to achieve? You wanted to achieve that calculation on a visual, because that is actually what you write your most measures for. They're going to be used on a visual. I already told you that. So what if we allowed you to give you to add a calculation onto a visual itself? Well, if we did that, then it's not inside of the model anymore. And so then all the filter context stuff that comes with being inside of the model just disappears, because there's a visual and the filter context has already been applied. Okay. What if we then allowed you to easily add business type calculations, to more easily write and read those kind of calculations? And what if you didn't want to do any typing, we could just rely on point and click? What if that will be an option? Wouldn't life be better? And that is what visual calcs are. Visual calcs, visual calculations are officially their name, but it's visual calcs for short. These are DAX calculations defined on a visual. Let me unpack that a little bit more. So if you think about Power BI as a pipeline, data is somewhere in a source, and it's being queried and transformed using Power Query and loaded into a data model, and then measures are applied, and then all the way at the end of the pipeline, there are visuals. So measures sit very much in the beginning of the pipeline, very early in the pipeline, where all the complexity of the model still exists. And the power of measures is that they can live inside of that model and that complexity. I'm not taking measures away from you. However, that's the only place where you can do calculations. All the way at the beginning, the unaggregated data with all the complexity, the high volume of data, and the filter context. With visual calcs, we're going to give you a way to add that same DAX calculation all the way at the end of the pipeline, just the last step before we paint that chart onto the screen. So then the aggregation, the filter context, everything has already been applied. So we went from millions and millions and millions of rows to maybe 10 rows. Because if you think about it, for a bar chart, for like a bar chart with sales for 3 countries, you don't need many millions of rows. Actually, what you need is just 3 numbers, sales for each country, and then 3 names of the countries. So basically 3 rows, 2 columns. Column country name, column sales amount, and 3 rows, 1 for each country with their name and the sales amount. And that's all you need to build that bar chart of 3 country sales onto the screen. It came from many millions of rows of records of sales and returns and everything where measures live inside the model. But when we're here, the only thing we really care about is this bar. And then if I wanted to do something with those numbers, I only have to deal with the complexity of 2 rows and 3 rows and 2 columns. That's easy. Anybody can do it, and I'm pretty sure that Power BI can do it as well. And that's where DAX calculations live. They defined on the visual. And they can refer to a field that's on the visual, including any other visual calc. So you can build a visual calculation on top of another visual calculation. You cannot refer to anything else. And that's on purpose, because the moment we would allow you to reach back out into the model, you would have to consider filter context again, and all the complexity that we just tried to hide from you is back. You have to worry about it again. So we made the deliberate choice of not allowing you to reach back to the model. If you want to reach back to something that's in the model, just bring it onto the visual. I'll show you how that's going to work in a second. And then on top of this, since we're now building calculations inside of a visual, we still don't have very interesting options available to us. We can say, you know what? Maybe you can refer to the visual structure. The visual has axes, right? It has a horizontal or vertical axis, maybe a third axis if you're a small multiple, or a scatter plot. You have different axes as well that you can play with for the size of the bubbles, for example. Okay, what if we can refer to those and then have a more flexible calculation that will basically adapt to whatever you throw on the visual? Just say, I will just happily do whatever calculation I'm doing over whatever is on the horizontal or vertical axis. And then most of the time, you don't have to worry about the complexity of filter context. Now, I'm saying most of the time here for legal reasons, because, you know, in all the time, actually, you don't have to worry about it. But there's cases when you want to be very advanced that you would have to potentially worry about this extra complexity again. But today, the goal is to take that away from you and say, hey, put some blinders on. You'll work inside of this little sandbox that's called the visual. Everything you need, everything you worry about is inside of that visual, and that's all you need. Nothing else. So then you might be sitting here and going like, okay, well, that's great. But wait, we already have so much complexity in Power BI. You already have so many tools in the toolbox. So are you now introducing another way of doing calculations? And the answer is yes. We're adding another way of doing calculations. We're not taking measures or calculated columns away from you. Both are still existing. We're just adding a new one, which is called visual calculations, which basically in a lot of ways combine the best of both worlds, right? So measures have their beauty. They handle large sets of data, they can handle complexity, etc. But they come with complexity as well. You have to worry about complexity when you start writing measures. Calculated columns are defined on a table, so their scope is limited. You can reach out to the model, but in basic principle, they only work on the table, and they work on a row by row basis. So it's different. It's easier. You can just look at a table and go like, yeah, I understand why this calculated column has this value now. So combining those two concepts together is where visual calculations really was born. So they're defined on a visual. They are executed at query context like a measure, but they are as simple as a calculated column because they work inside this little sandbox. And then on top of that, they have interesting tricks up their sleeve where they can refer to the visual structure. Now, so visual calculations are easy and flexible. They're WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. I'll show you that in just a second. Point and click provided if you want. That is eventually will be there. What we are today, no. Yep, Pragati, what's going on?
Yeah, so I just got one question from Christian. So he's asking, we understand these visual calcs are referring to the visual where they are built. Is there a way to reference them naming the visual.calc in another visual, basically reuse them in another visual, naming the home visual?
Not at this point, no. We are working on this. We're thinking about what the reuse story is, but at this point, there's none. At this point, there's copy paste to another visual and potentially promoting visual calcs to model measures to store them back into the model. That's another avenue we're pursuing. But right now, since visual calcs are really tied to the visual, it doesn't make a lot of sense to allow you to refer to it, because if the visual calc says do calculation over the horizontal axis, that might mean something completely different inside of another visual. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to allow them to be reused that way. So the story right now is there's not a lot of reuse.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take 2 more questions and go ahead?
Yeah, I think the next one is from Klaus, right? Can visual calculation be used for dynamic headers on a page? No visual in scope. No, you will have to have a visual. So visual calculations are numerical in state. You can also have strings, but they are on the visual, so you cannot use them for something else. You have to have a visual in scope, but it could just be a card. If you can wrestle your dynamic header into a card, then that's still a visual. So if you can make it happen inside of that card visual, then yes, the answer to Klaus's question is yes. Otherwise, the answer is no.
Okay. Okay, and I think Daryl is also asking, does this replace implicit measures?
No, it does not. You can still use implicit measure. We're not replacing anything. We're just adding another tool to your toolbox.
Okay.
And then Christian is asking, well, the copy paste will only work with the formula. We'll only get the formula. And that, Christian, dear friend, is a wrong assumption. I didn't say that. That's you assuming that we only copy paste the formula. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to bring everything that the visual calc needs over into the other visual when you copy paste. So, Christian, what you're stating there is not entirely true, because we're bringing over the elements that it needs, so it will keep working into the other visual. I'll talk about that in just a sec.
Sure. And I think
you forgot to add the question mark. Yes, you did.
And I think Ricardo just, I think this should come from you. Actually, Ricardo is just asking like when this will be available within Power BI.
Yeah, so we're currently targeting March next year for the public preview. So this has been in private preview for a year now, almost, I think, at least 3/4 of a year. But we're targeting March next year for public preview.
Okay, thanks, Jay. I think that's it we have for now, but I'll let you know if we have more.
Yep. So point and click will be provided if you want it. Right now, it's a typing experience. We're still building the whole point and click thing, what I'm going to show you in a second. We'll introduce new functions that are specific to visual calcs that will do specific common business type calculations. I already gave you a hint of a couple of those because we already mentioned them, and they will be allowed to refer to the visual structure. Now, the mental model that I want you to have before I jump into the demo is any visual that you have today in Power BI can be represented as a matrix. Any visual, right? So your bar chart, your map, your scatter plot, whatever you have, you can always represent it as a matrix. That matrix might have multiple fields on the rows, might have multiple fields on the columns, yes, but it can always be represented as a matrix. And that's our ingoing assumption. And so far that has held true. And that's what we're basing visual calcs on, because we're giving you a screen, and the mockup is right here, where the visual you're working in is on top. And then what we call the visual matrix or data grid is at the bottom. And these two things are aligned, they're connected. The visual on top is the thing you're working with, but the data grid at the bottom is where you actually define the calculations, and then they show up in the visual. So these two things are combined. Think about this as the data grid showing the data that's inside of the visual. And then in between, to separate those things, you will have a formula bar. And that formula bar will allow you to type DAX and eventually allow you to click around and interact with the data grid to write your DAX expression. So we're not hiding the DAX expression from you, by the way. We're showing you it because it's also a learning tool for you to work with DAX and learn and explore DAX. Okay, so with that out of the way, I want to say one more thing. Once visual calcs are a reality, we expect most of you to start using them instead of measures or instead of calc columns. And the reasons are very simple. A, they're very simple to make. They're very simple to create. Very simple to maintain. They're very simple to read and understand. And the last one is the kicker, the performance. Because if you wanted to do a profit calculation over all of your sales, today you do that in a measure. And it basically says, take the sum of sales amount minus the sum of product cost. If you have millions and millions and millions of sales records, that is basically what it will do. It will go to the lowest level, the lowest grain, the lowest level of detail, which is the individual sales record, and start summing up all the sales and then summing up all the total product cost and subtracting those. But if you're only interested in doing that profit for those 3 countries that we talked about before, I don't need this millions of rows right here. I just need those, in this case, 6 numbers to subtract for 3 countries. The performance of that will obviously be faster than doing that on many millions of rows. And I'm confident to say that whatever complicated DAX calculation you will write in a visual calc, I'm confident to say that Power BI will probably be able to handle it, because the number of rows there is not going to be millions and millions and millions of rows, because nobody shows millions and millions and millions of rows in the visual, because simply we humans cannot process that kind of stuff. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's look at a demo. So this is no fake. This is actual in product today. What I'm going to show you is very close to our public preview scope that we're gonna have. We're still buttoning up some stuff, so there's some rough edges here and there. But I'm not faking anything here. This is not Figma. This is live. So this can also completely break. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. So this is just regular Power BI desktop, well, not actual regular Power BI desktop. Sorry, somebody wanted to say something? No? Okay. Cool. So let me just create a visual. I'll take sales amount and I'll take total product cost. And let me just add product category. And then we turn this into a bar chart, right? Nothing fancy, nothing hiding so far, nothing weird. So we're now just seeing the normal bar chart. Now on here, what I actually wanted to do is I wanted to add a calculation. I want to be able to do, for example, something like profit. I know profit is a bad example because I should have done it as a measure. I should have just created a measure that says sum of sales amount minus sum of total product cost, but just as an example. So what I can do is I can now go in here and use this button here that says new calculation. And that is only available when I have a visual selected. If I'm not on a visual, you can't select it, right? So new calculation. And then once I click that button, I'm in that window that I just showed you on the slides. The visual is on top, the bar is in the middle, and then the visual matrix is at the bottom, the data grid is at the bottom. And immediately it's inviting, it's telling me, hey, you can just start writing a calculation in here. You can already see what's happening because we gave you a placeholder, right? The calculation is empty, but you see that the calculation will show itself as an extra column on the data grid. Additionally, you see that that calculation has already gotten place in the visual, right? So you see the orange thing here in the legend. Of course, there's nothing in here because, well, the calculation is empty so far, right? So now let me just write something simple. I can do profit equals sales amount minus total product cost. Now, couple of interesting things here. Nowhere do I refer to this, to the table. Nowhere, because I only work inside this little sandbox. So I work with the things that I can see. I don't care if sales amount came from table A and total product cost came from table B. At this point, all of that complexity has been handled. The filter context is gone. We just have the fields that I have here in my little sandbox. So I don't care that it came maybe from a different table. In this case, it came from the same table. And then again, I'm not caring about the aggregates here. I'm just subtracting two numbers. I'm subtracting 4 rows of, or 5 rows, depending on if you count the total or not, of two numbers, right? And if I hit enter, what will happen is this will just simply be executed and calculated very quickly. And then you see the bar appearing. Now, of course, again, as I said, this should really have been a measure, right? That's the way you do it today. Because it's such a basic calculation, I would advise you to keep doing this in a measure, but I'm just starting with a very simple example. Now, one other trick that I want to show you, that you might be thinking, well, wait, since everything that I can work with, it has to be on the visual. You just said that, I did. My visual will be very crowded, right? I add all the 20 ingredients and I only wanted to show the end result on the visual. And can I then remove fields from the data grid after I'm done? Well, no, because if I remove sales amount from this, then my profit calculation, since it refers to sales amount, will stop working. So I cannot remove stuff from my data grid. However, we can absolutely hide stuff from the visual. So we have a little capability with this eye icon here that allows me to hide everything else from the visual except for the one that I'm after, which is a profit calculation. So Ricardo asks about typing. Today, we don't have formatting capabilities yet. That will all come. So we're still in preview. That is absolutely right. You will see more of those examples in the rest of my demo that the format is being stripped. You can just use the format function to apply that back on. Yes, Brugatti.
So there's just one more question. So Ricardo is asking, this is not automatically converted to the right type. I'm assuming, Ricardo, it's about data type you're talking, right?
Yes, it's about the fact that I subtracted two currencies and I'm not getting a currency symbol in front.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's true. That is something that we're still working on. You can also not format these yet, like you can with a normal column. That's all coming.
Okay, cool. And then there was one more from Christian earlier. By the description you have done, visual calcs will work with implicit measures too, like drag and drop on a visual.
Correct.
Is my understanding right? If so, how can we discourage the use of implicit measures? Okay.
Well, I mean, they will work with implicit measures, and Visual Calcs doesn't change anything here. You can still set the discourage implicit measures flag on your model, and then desktop will not allow people to create implicit measures. This is called discourage for a reason, because desktop will follow those rules. If you set that flag to discourage implicit measure on a model true, desktop will not allow somebody to create an implicit measure. So, you know, if they use desktop, they will be stopped. But there's also loads of third-party tools out there, and Microsoft doesn't control what those third-party tools do with that flag, right? So that's why it's called discourage and not disable, because we don't control what they do, right? They can completely ignore this flag and still allow people to create implicit measures. So whenever you see the word discourage that we use it in many other cases as well. It is about the fact that if you set that flag, desktop, so Microsoft built tools will honor that flag, will say, okay, no implicit measures for you, but we don't control what third parties do. So that's why it's discourage and not disable. So I'm just picking up on that one word there. For example, in the composite models world, we have a discourage composite model flag. If you set that on a model, Power BI Desktop will stop you from creating another composite from this model, because you effectively told it, this is the end state. I don't want anybody to continue building after this. So you set that, Desktop will stop you from it. If you use some other tool, they can do whatever they want. They can completely ignore it. So that's why it's called discourage. Okay. Anyway, so they will work with implicit measures. Can you change the format type in the visual properties? Yeah. Yes, you can eventually. You cannot now. I'm just picking up the question from Sue. That's just, we haven't finished it.
Okay, cool. And I think there's one more from Aisha. If we have renamed the measure in the visual, are these calcs using the new name in the formula?
Well, let's just try. Why not? This is a demo after all. Let me just make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see. So I'm going to say Aisha's sales amount. And there you go. Profit still works and now just refers to Aisha's sales amount. So the answer to your question, Aisha, is a resounding yes. Cool. All right.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Jay.
I knew this was going to work, so that's why I was confident to just show it. Okay, cool. So let's get add a new calculation in here. And this is little FX button in here. And that allows me to open up templates. And templates are quick and easy starting points to discover more about what you can do with Visual Calc. You don't have to use templates. It's more like discoverability of things that you can do. You can absolutely just type the formula name after you know it. So let's just do, I will skip for templates for just another second. So let's say I wanted to compare profit with the previous profit, right? So I have profit now, great. But now I want to compare each category to the one that's just above it in the chart. So what function would I have to use? Well, today index, there's weird, interesting things in here, right? I top N1 and earlier, whatever. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But I want to show the comparison for the previous profit. Previous profit. It would be great if there was a function called, let's say, previous, maybe? Oh, let's see. Can I just do versus previous profit? Maybe do profit minus previous? Oh, there we go. Huh. Okay. Profit minus previous. That sounds simple. Would it work? Well, yes, of course it works. I built this, so I know what I'm doing. But anyway, the goal here is to make you understand that we actually thought about these function names, and the function names you'll discover are so simple that you can walk up to this and go like, I wonder if I could do something with next or first or last. And you can actually dream up the DAX expression, and the chances are that it's probably correct. This is as simple as it gets. I mean, I cannot make this any more simple, right? You wanted to do a profit versus a previous profit. This is literally what you have to write, nothing else. No more top N1, no more earliers, no more filters and calculates on top of it. This is literally just the DAX expression that you have to write. Okay, so I think Sue was asking for the fan favorite here to see running sum. Well, let me open the FX button in here. So here are the templates that we have for you. Running sum, moving average, percent of pairing, percent of grand total, average of children versus previous, versus first, versus last, and versus next. You can now probably already fill in what the names are of these functions, right? Versus previous. Well, that's a template for previous. Versus next. Well, that was a template that used the next function. So you can probably already kind of like guess the names here. So would there be a very simple way to do running sum? Well, guess what? What would be the name of the function for running sum? Any guesses? I'm playing with you. Of course, you know what I'm going to say right now. It's literally called running sum. So I'm just going to say running sum of profit. Whoops. And hit OK. And now I have a running sum of profit. It is that simple. You wanted to do a moving average? Let's do a moving average. Oh, there's a function called moving average. I wanted to do a moving average over Aisha's sales amount because that thing is still here, right? Even though we don't show it, I can still use it. And I wanted to do a moving average over the two categories, right? And now I have a moving average over two categories. So of course, there's like loads of interesting things in here. You see that I'm now blowing up my visual. I'm showing all kinds of things on the visual that I shouldn't be showing. So maybe I didn't want to show profit in the end. I only are interested, maybe the versus previous can go, that can stay. Running sum, yes, I'm just going to move the running sum and maybe the moving average as well to the tooltip, right? So now I have the versus previous and I have the running sum and the moving average in the tooltip. So if I exit out of this, what I'm showing you is just something that didn't exist before, right? The versus previous profit, running sum and moving average didn't exist before. This now does not exist in the model. I just built it in just a very simple couple steps using some very simple basic DAX, and then I was able to show that inside of the tooltips and on the visual itself. So that is basically what visual calcs are. It's very simple. I think we can all agree that writing these DAX statements is simple, but I will hammer home the point in just a second in the slides once more.
I think, okay. Jay, just one more thing before you go forward. You created this view previous profit, right?
Mm-hmm.
V previous profit. So yeah, I think Sue just asked previous profit of what is that? Is it last row, or how did it calculate the previous profit basically?
So I'm going to walk up to the DAX expression again. So the V previous profit literally takes the current profit for each row and looks up the previous profit for the row above it. Right? So you have versus previous profit. So that is this 600 and something minus there's nothing above me. So the number here is the same. This guy, the 10 million something, says, okay, this minus this, the profit for accessories. So that is going to be 980 or almost 10 million, right? This guy is saying, for clothing, I have 368. The one above me is 10 million. So I'm going to be negative, minus 10 million and something. That is how this works. It's literally just saying the previous means in this case, because I'm skipping over details that I'll show you in just a second. I'm moving upwards. Previous is upwards, right? So looking above me in this case. You can all configure this. I'll tell you that in just a second. But by default, previous is going to look upwards. Next is going to look downwards. Okay. So I hope that answers the question.
Yep.
And then is the total correct? Yes, the total is correct because that is how DAX works. Who's asking that? London DBA. The total is absolutely correct because it is normal. It's DAX executes totals. DAX doesn't take visual totals, right? It executes the DAX expression on the total level. So there's no other level to compare this with. So that is what versus previous profit will do. So it actually is correct. However, if you wanted to change that, we have tools in the toolbox to allow you to define what's happening on the total. But I'll show you that in the slide in just a sec. So is there any other question? Is sorting available? So that's a question, Christian, that's interesting. We need to unpack that a little bit more. What do you mean with sorting on modifying the calculations? Because there is multiple things you can mean with sorting in here. You can absolutely sort this visual by the result, right? So I can sort by the versus previous, right? So I can sort it to have like the biggest one at the top and the lowest one at the bottom. I can absolutely do that, but that might not be what you mean with sort. There's different things in here. So sort the visual ascending and descending, that's what I just did based on the visual calc. So if that's what you're after, Christian, I just showed you that that is a possibility. We don't have a previous row, and that's because previous already says row. But I'll talk about that in just a sec when I get back to the slides. Cool. So this is the point where you go onto some social media and you post something that I just blew your mind with DAX and Power BI. If you would do that, don't feel that's a requirement, but I would encourage you to do it because it would make my day. So feel free to do that at any point. Cool. So just to summarize, what are visual calcs? They are DAX calculations in the scope of a visual. And in support of that capability, we will introduce new functions and a couple of new concepts. And let's talk about those. And I think most of the questions that are right now in the chat are about those concepts. Okay, so to hammer home the point, this is just DAX. We're not inventing a new language. So any DAX, most DAX will work. So for example, a switch with a true statement to tag orders for like a certain category will work as is today in a calculated column. You can just copy paste it into your visual calc, assuming the names line up, and it will just work. Basic arithmetic, I already showed you, will work. And then we'll have new visual calcs functions that I will just show you in a second. So For example, let's compare it to our current state. The goal here is to implement a running sum calculation that sums sales amount over year. The current DAX is here on the screen. It's calculate sum filter all selected is on or after. This is arguably not the most complicated DAX ever, but it's also not the easiest DAX, and we cannot safely assume that a beginning user will easily just, write this down. However, in Visual Calcs, the only thing they have to do is write running sum sales amount, assuming we have years on the rows axis. We'll talk about what the rows axis means in just a second, which basically means if it's in this direction on where accessories were in my previous example, then running sum sales amount will do a running sum of sales over years. So literally just writing that expression. Another idea, give a list of states and a number of restaurants per state. For each state, calculate the difference in number of restaurants in that state versus the one above. The original DAX is on the left here, which includes a top N1 and loads of filters and selected values and summarized tricks. To be honest, I didn't write this on my own. I had help from Jeffrey to do this, Jeffrey Wang, the inventor of DAX. On the right, there's the window functions that we shipped in December that make this very easy already with offset, but it's still too complicated. And then on top of that, I can now just do number of restaurants minus previous number of restaurants in Visual Calcs, and I'm done. And here's an important point. If you were paying attention to December, you might have wondered, what are those guys doing? They're releasing window functions. Why are we investing this? Why are you spending time on this? And the reason why is because I can see it was confusing. And I just showed you the Lego pieces in December that I was using to build this Visual Calc stuff with. So the window functions are essentially the foundation under everything else that that Visual Calcs are. So previous is essentially a shortcut, an easier way of working with offset. So what are we introducing? We're introducing low, medium, and high level functions. The good news is the low level functions are already there. You already can play with them today. They are called window functions. Okay, so window functions, offset, index, window, rank, and row number. They are supported by order by, partition by, and match by. If you want to learn more about these, go onto our documentation. They have been out there for almost a year now. They allow you to do relative and absolute movement. So these are easier, but still too complicated. So on top of that, we're building medium level functions and then high level functions. And that is what makes Visual Calc so easy. So we'll have the following medium level functions. Those are all shortcuts to the low level functions. So previous is a shortcut to offset. Next is a shortcut to offset. First and last are shortcuts to index. Range is a shortcut to window. And then we'll add some more expand and expand all that allows you to add more detail for average of children kind of calculations, and collapse all that allows you to take away detail. Somebody was asking about the total. Here it is. That's how you're going to figure out when you are on the total row to give a different result for the total, for collapse all. And then is at level will allow you to do it even easier to figure out, hey, am I currently at the total level? Then I want to do something different on the total instead of the default behavior of DAX. And then lookup, X lookup, H lookup, V lookup in Excel. This is exactly the same. Lookup will allow you to say, find the year, find the category, that number I want. So the sales amount for year 2022 and country equals United Kingdom, that number is the one I want to use in my formula. Then on top of those, we'll have high-level functions, and I already showed you both. They're running sum and moving average. So those are the functions that we're introducing. So the low-level functions you can use today in calculated columns and in measures. The medium-level functions, the high-level functions, you will not be able to use outside of Visual Calcs. That's because they refer to axes. I haven't shown you that because we have a default value for axes, but they all refer to it. They're all built on the concept of knowing that I'm inside of the visual, knowing about the structure of the visual. So these functions, previous, next, first, last, etc., running sum, they are all tied to Visual Calcs. You cannot use them in a measure, but you will always be able to express what those things do inside of the lower level functions. So you can always rewrite a Visual Calc into a measure if you really wanted to. That's why the window functions exist. Okay, so a couple of new concepts to talk about. The visual matrix or the data grid is the thing that I showed you at the bottom here. Now I mentioned this thing called axes. So this defines how a calculation traverses the data grid or the visual matrix on which it's being executed. And then reset defines if and when a calculation will restart while it's traversing this visual matrix. And then direction, when you hear that word, it basically is a combination of axis and reset together. And then hidden is a field on the visual matrix that is not shown on the visual. I already showed you that with the little eye icon. So axis. Think of axis as how the calculation moves over the visual matrix on which it's being executed. The default is rows. Read this as across rows. Rows are horizontal things, so going across horizontal things means going downwards. That's what the icon is also indicating. The other option is columns, which is across columns. So that is, since columns are vertical, horizontally moving from left to right. So those are the two basic ones that I expect you to use, but then there's other twos. There's combinations of rows and columns, which is columns rows and rows columns, which we don't really expect you to use, but we put it in for completionist sake. It allows you to do like snaking movements over the visual matrix. So for example, with columns rows, you would go horizontally across the columns and then keep going downwards, still reminding you of the value that was above you when you were traversing to the next row. And the same for rows and columns, but then do it vertically first and then horizontally. Again, these are very advanced and I don't see a lot of business value in them, but there are a few scenarios in which it makes sense, so we built them anyway, but the vast majority will just rely on rows and columns. Now the product today helps you with that. So let me show you the product again. So I can absolutely just do a versus previous on profit and be very explicit and say, I wanted to do this on rows. Look how the product helps you and it tells you what this thing does. It has a little icon here. So now if I select rows here, it will now just be very explicit. The value won't change because I just did the same thing because rows is the default. Also notice there is no columns here because I cannot type columns because there is no columns, right? So today there's no field here on the columns because I am in a bar chart, right? But if I added something on this that says maybe a year or whatever to do something more intelligent, to say, hey, let's just convert this visual into a matrix. Let me add a year. Okay, so now we have the year, and then we have each column being repeated for each of the years. And now I can say, you know what, the versus previous is now still on rows, so it's still comparing category against category. But what if I didn't want to do category of category? I want to do years. So now I can say, hey, I actually wanted columns. Columns is now available to me. So this will say, take the profit for each year and compare it to the previous year. So this is now not going this direction, but this direction across the visual matrix, right? So now I'm changing how this thing will operate. And now I'm comparing year over year over year. You see how this will start working? Axis by default is rows, so we'll always go top to bottom. Previous is top to bottom, right? Previous moves up, but previous in horizontal is to the left. And then next in horizontal is to the right. So we don't have previous column, we don't have previous row. We thought about that at the beginning. We didn't do it. We just said previous and then rows you can specify, but you don't have to. Columns, if you wanted to, and you wanted to do the more advanced scenarios, you can now do columns, rows, and rows, columns. And that's why we didn't do previous row, because then I would have to write previous columns rows, which doesn't make any sense. So that's why we landed on just previous and then having a special parameter that is the axis. So examples, first of sales amount on rows, which basically rows is again is optional, retrieves for each row the first sales amount from the first row, right? So look at the result here. The dashed line will always repeat the same number because it's for each column the same number for the first in that column in the first row, right? So that one, the green one, the blue one, they all line up. Makes sense. First on columns, which would do the same thing, but then over the columns. So basically says the dashed lines all refer to the first sales amount in the first year in this case. I can also write first sales amount on year. It will give me the same result. Okay, now this is where it's going to be very a little bit harder to follow. What if I did rows columns? Then for each cell, retrieve the previous sales amount from the row above it or from the last cell in the previous column. So what will happen here is the dashed results are happily taking the result from the previous row, makes sense. But then once I'm here, instead of an empty result as this cell is, because there's no previous column for me to take the value from, in this case, there is a previous column to take the value from. So I'm going to refer to this guy, right? So this number is now the sales amount for 2018 for components, right? And then we keep going. So this is the snake, the planter movement going down and then horizontally, right? And then, of course, the opposite 90 degrees turned is the snake, which would do horizontal and then vertically, right? So happily, this guy refers to this green box refers to that, great. This blue box doesn't refer to anything that's on the same line, but can absolutely refer to the sales amount from the previous row on the last column, right? So this is how we move like a typewriter over your matrix. Again, I'm not expecting to use these last two very often. Columns and rows will probably be, for 95% of the cases, enough. But hey, they're here, so that's something you can work with. Now, one last concept that I want to show you before I'm opening it up for questions. There's a concept called reset. So by default, reset is none. We don't restart. But we can restart on a certain level. We can restart for every quarter or every year. So if I have multiple years on a visual and I do a running sum, right? So I have years and quarters and I'm doing running sum, then happily, without a reset, the running sum will keep counting. So when we get to Q1 for the next year, we'll just take the value that it had for Q4 of the last year and add the value for Q1 of this year to it and keep going. That is probably not what you wanted. So with reset, we can now just say, hey, calculate a running sum, reset on year. So that basically means whenever the value of year changes, restart my calculation. So now I have a running sum that actually calculates all the quarters. And then once the year changes, starts over from 0 and starts again with just the value for Q1, right? So that's what reset will do. It's not there in the product yet. It's coming soon. Hopefully it will be there for public preview. And then you will have various options in here to play with this in more detail. So with that, I'm gonna look at the time and open it up for questions. And